As long as we need and want products and services that others make or create, the globalization is here to stay. Nations have explored the earth to reach other civilizations and at times gone to wars, whether it is for spice or spices or silk or precious metals like gold and silver. But civilizations have been subjugated and colonies were created only to get reliable supply of products of choices of the time. In recent centuries, manufactured goods have become objects of desire as the rich want to dress themselves in style and poor demand cheap and cheaper goods to access more technology driven lifestyle. Whether it is the latest designer dress or the cheapest and the most expensive phones, meaning the cell phones, they all have global journeys and often rocky journeys, often carefully drafted by entrepreneurs and governments. To tell us more about these global origins and journey, we have with us Marc Levinson, the author of the latest book, Outside the Box, How Globalization Changed from Moving Stuff to Spreading Ideas. Marc has also written a number of other books, including the very popular book, The Box. And Marc is also an economist and historian and currently resides in Washington, D.C. Welcome to Redera.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Fascinating book. It has a different take on a term or activity that we have come to engage in called international trade, but it has taken different names. How globalization currently is perceived, and what is the origin of the term in the last 300 years since we have been kind of actively engaging in international trade?
Well, my book here is designed as a short and hopefully lively and even exciting history of globalization to explain how we got to the point where globalization is so controversial. There's a lot of loose talk about how globalization is nothing new. Globalization has been around since the Pharaohs and the Assyrians, and so on and so forth. And I thought it would be useful to put a little structure around this to explain how we got to the current stage of globalization and why that is now changing. Uh, it's quite true that trade has been around for thousands of years, but globalization in its modern sense goes back to the 19th century. If you think about trade in earlier times, it really had a, a couple of important characteristics. One is that the quantity of trade was actually pretty small. Everybody's heard the stories of the European ships that sailed to the East Indies for spices, and that was long distance globalization. And that's true, but there were only a handful of those ships that actually made the trip each year. The quantities traded were quite small, and the people who were affected were typically a tiny proportion of the population, either the people who grew or produced the commodity in one country, and the elites in the other country that bought these very expensive items, whether it was pepper or silk or coffee or whatever. Trade was not a mass product. The other thing that I would say about those earlier versions of international trade is that goods were exported with no idea of who they were going to be sold to. They would simply be shipped to a foreign country and then typically sold at auction there whenever they arrived. There was no such thing as a supply chain in the modern sense. There was no reliable source of supply. There was no reliable timeline for getting supplies to another country. And so the economy didn't work that way. This really started to change only in the 1830s and 1840s when we started to get steamships on international routes. There was communication by telegraph, which made it possible to tell people that, hey, this is coming your way. And it was possible also to have a much larger flow of international investment. So globalization in the modern sense really then started less than 200 years ago. I think people who've looked into this are aware that globalization grew substantially before the First World War and then was more or less shut off until after the Second World War. What I describe in Outside the Box is how in the late 1980s, globalization took a totally unexpected turn. And that was with the development of long distance supply chains, what we call today value chains. These are chains that divided up manufacturing production into many different stages, often happening in many different countries. And in order for this to happen, three developments were necessary. One, which I wrote about in my book, The Box, was the shipping container, which helped make transport much cheaper and more reliable. The second was a dramatic fall in the cost of making a phone call, of telecommunications. And the third was the development of lower cost computer infrastructure. So it actually became practical for a company in one country to manage supply chains in other countries. And this sort of globalization, the globalization of the long distance value chains, really began in the late 1980s and transformed the world economy. This is what really led to the shift of manufacturing from the wealthy countries to East Asia, Mexico, other places where wages were lower, and really made a drastic change in living standards for many people, both in the rich countries and in the poorer ones.
You know, in the fascinating history that you explain in the book, there was a one nugget of information that really caught my attention, as you explained just now, that the entire global trade capacity using the ocean carrier or ships or whatever you want to call them at that time would amount to less than half of one container cargo ship today.
Oh, yes. I don't think people understand the change in volumes. Back in the 1400s, 1500s, a country like Venice, which of course was then an independent state and was the world's main trading power. And it was famed for the Venetian fleet that sailed across the Mediterranean, bringing in goods from Asia and sailed as far as England. But all of the ships that sailed for Venice each year carried less cargo in a year than a modern container ship. So the scale of today's trade was really unimaginable back then.
The number of technological changes along the way have helped, but also the governments, the deregulations, and our expectations as consumers also have transformed and in many ways accelerated these trends. One of the fascinating things that you've done in the book is that you kind of tried to put it in waves or stages of globalization. In the early stage, where to use this example to carry the discussion forward, is that a Swiss trader may have to pay just to travel less than 100 miles, about 500 places duties just to move the goods. And we have come a long way since then. So tell us what were the impediments or hurdles, and also what were the urges to purchase or source goods from one place to other place.
There were really very big hurdles to international trade into the 1800s. And I lay out a number of them. One is obviously that transport costs were extremely high, especially by land. You could only move small quantities of goods. It took a long time. It was very, very costly to do. So a lot of things weren't worth trading. Governments everywhere put very high obstacles to trade. These took the form of tariffs. A tariff is a tax on imports. And these were imposed not only by national governments, but in places like Germany by local governments. If you wanted to move your goods through a town or along a certain road, you would have to pay a tax or a toll. And so if you were just carrying your goods a couple hundred miles, you could end up paying a very high proportion of their value just in these taxes. You had to pay taxes to use the rivers and the canals. And all of this tended to discourage trade. What really led to change in this was a change in how people thought about trade. And I trace this to the British economist David Ricardo, who in the early 1800s showed that trade could be good for the country that imported as well as the country that exported. This seems like kind of a simple idea now, but it was pretty revolutionary back then. Up until that point, the notion was exports are good because they help our country sell things and amass gold, and imports are bad because they weaken us and they destroy jobs and they take our gold and require us to send it to the other country. So the prevailing attitude before then, which is what we know as mercantilism, was that imports were to be avoided and exports were to be maximized. Ricardo showed that imports could be a good thing, that both parties benefited from trade. And that change in thinking about trade led to reductions in trade barriers really all over the world during the 19th century.
As we progress from mercantilism, as you mentioned, we became more and more dependent, and that theory of comparative advantages, as David Ricardo is famously known for, relied on certain basic foundations that the nations don't go to war with each other, there are no viruses, and we all like each other and like to work with each other. And that held true for many, many centuries and continues to do so as we rely on more and more people and more nations to source goods from all over the world. But as you explained very well in the book, something called contract freight, that ocean carriers would travel only when they can get enough freight to go around, and they would not have a predictable schedule or predictable delivery time. All that started changing as technology evolved and also as our practices changed. Explain us a little bit more about how the contract freight came about and how that impacted the movement of ships on the ocean.
Sure. Depending how far you want to go back, but if you go back really before the steamships started sailing internationally in the 1840s, a ship carrying freight would often either sit at the dock until it was full, or it would sail along the coast picking up stuff here and there. So if you had something at Savannah or Philadelphia, and you wanted to send it to Germany, you put it in a warehouse by the dock and you waited until a ship came along. And that ship would come along when it wanted to, and it would spend as long in port as it wanted to. And your goods would get there eventually, but there was no telling when. There was no such thing as a schedule. Steamships introduced schedules, but without too much precision, and most freight really didn't arrive that way. And then we got into a situation in which the shipping industry formed cartels and tried to regulate the prices of international freight. Governments encouraged this because it kind of stabilized the industry. But what it meant was that you, as a shipper, you didn't have much clout. Okay, you took what was given to you, and your goods would get where they were supposed to go at the same time as everybody else's. There was no special deal for you. You paid the same price, and service was not very good. There was no precision in this industry. What happened after the container came into being was that the ocean transport and also domestic transport, trucks and trains, began to be deregulated. And what that meant was the shipper, okay, this is the party that owns the freight and wants to move it, the shipper could now negotiate terms. And so there could be a deal between, for example, a shipper and a ship line or a trucking company or whoever, that the shipper will make the freight available on this date. It will be delivered at this location on this date. If there is a late delivery, there will be a penalty paid. But if the shipper doesn't have the shipment available, there'll be a penalty paid too. People had to perform. And what that meant was that it was possible to build supply chains with a high degree of reliability. This had never been something that companies could do before, but in the 1980s, this was now a possibility. It happened first internationally in the domestically in the United States. We deregulated air freight and then trucking and then railroads. And then it started to happen internationally. So here, think of yourself as a US retailer, and you want to have your goods made in other places. It's not really very attractive to do that if you don't know when the goods are going to get to your warehouse and your store. But if you can sign a contract that gives you some assurance that your goods are going to be delivered on time, now it becomes more interesting to have a long distance supply chain. And that's really what started to happen in the 1980s.
A very simple thing that we take for granted today, but it has some, it was revolutionary when it was first started in the late 80s, as you mentioned. You also mentioned a very important word there, container. This is all started, as you explained in your previous book, when the after the Second World War, when we had Vietnam War, and the military needed better predictability and a better way to move things around between the U.S. and Vietnam. But that revolutionized the whole shipping industry. Give us a little bit of a kind of preview on that, or explanation how revolutionary that it was, even though it just seems like a simple box, but that box had a huge impact in what we consume today and from where.
Sure, and your listeners can find more about this story in my book, The Box. But the container came along in the United States in the mid-1950s and then internationally starting in 1966. Before you had the shipping container, there was what was known as break bulk freight, which meant that items were shipped individually. If, for example, you had a factory somewhere in the US Midwest and you made a motor and you wanted to ship that motor to Europe, you had a crew of carpenters working in the back of your factory. They built a wooden crate specially for your motor. It was put onto a truck, taken to a port, put into a warehouse. Whenever a ship arrived, that crate would be taken out of the warehouse, taken onto the dock, put together with some other cargo on a pallet, lifted into the hold of a ship, and then that crate, along with each of those other items, would be shoved into place during the voyage. And that process would be repeated. There were typically probably 200,000 items on a ship sailing the Atlantic in the 1950s. So you can imagine that the process of loading a ship was time consuming and very expensive. There was a lot of labor involved because every single one of those 200,000 items was being moved around by hand. It could take a week or two to load a ship. It could take a week or two at the other end of the voyage to unload the ship. There was no assurance at all when the freight would arrive at the final destination. It commonly took 3 months or more for something shipped from the United States to show up at the customer's location in Europe with no guarantee about when it would arrive. And the container did away with all that. It became possible to have much larger shipments, so much less handling at the dock and en route. Fewer things got lost or stolen. Reliability was much higher because now the freight could be lifted quickly aboard a ship. It took a day to load a ship instead of a week or two. And the ship line could give the customer assurance. We sail every Tuesday. This ship arrives in Rotterdam 7 days later. Your freight will arrive at your destination in Stuttgart 3 days after that. And all of a sudden, shippers now had some assurance that what they were sending would actually get where it was supposed to go when it was supposed to go there. That's really a key to the modern supply chain.
The globalization or international trade, whatever you want to call it at that stage, received some very strong impetuses or catalysts in the late 70s and early 80s. With the arrival of the cheap telecommunication, with the arrival of faster or better quality ships, and then the emergence of China, the China arriving on the global stage and participating in global economies, everything changed dramatically. Explain to us how the arrival of China or before China, the countries in East Asia, including Japan and Taiwan and South Korea later on, had a dramatic impact on shipment of goods from Asia to United States as the theater changed a bit onto the Pacific Ocean, then from the Atlantic Ocean.
Sure. Once you had container freight working internationally, it of course was put into use from Asia to North America and Europe, so starting with Japan in the late 1960s, then with Korea in the 1970s and Hong Kong. And so now producers in the United States or in Europe that were looking for lower wage sources to manufacture their goods, they could look abroad. And these faraway countries suddenly became practical places to manufacture certain types of things. There were still a lot of trade barriers. Tariffs on some things were quite high, particularly clothing and textiles. China was not part of the world trading system at all. It didn't really have any significant international trade in the 1970s or even in the 1980s. But trade in those days still typically happened as a transaction between a rich country and a poor country, okay? You had a factory in a place that made something and you sent it to the rich country where it would be consumed, okay? That started to change a lot in the late 1980s because of these other factors, because of the improved communication, because of the improved computerization, so you could actually manage where things were being made and where things were being shipped. And as a result of that, manufacturers and retailers started to build more complicated international supply chains. They could make this component in this location or have somebody else make this component in this location and ship it to some other location for further processing, and then ship that processed product somewhere else still for final assembly into another type of good. This was a very, very different form of globalization. I don't know if your listeners are aware of this, but most of the products that come into the United States, even today, in these shipping containers, are not consumer goods ready to go on store shelves. They are partially finished goods. They're things that have been made in part in other countries. And they're coming to the United States either for final assembly or for additional work in the United States before they're exported again to some other location.
What we would call intermediate goods.
Intermediate goods is what economists call these things. And that type of trade barely existed before the 1980s. That's really at the heart of the sort of globalization that developed in the 1980s and became very significant in the early 2000s as China became such a manufacturing powerhouse.
So you brought up a number of issues here. One, we had an existing pattern at least until 60s and 70s where the poor nations were all they could do was to export commodities, and the rich nations would only export back to them the manufactured goods. And those things started changing first with the arrival of Japan and then with many other countries. Second, with the cheaper communications, instead of nations trading with each other, it is now corporations that are setting up their own operations to source their own products and bring the stuff or intermediate goods back to the United States or Europe, wherever they needed to go. And the third thing, as you explained in the book after that, the corporations even moved beyond that. That rather than having their own factories and their own people, they started looking for truly, as we call it, supply chain, where they start relying on others to send the stuff to them.
That's right. I talk in the book about how globalization began changing again in the first decade of the 2000s, um, because, in part because of the financial crisis that was around 2008, but also because of changes in the way that companies did business. And you're hitting on some of them. We saw, for example, that foreign direct investment, that is, how much a company in one country invests in another country in owning companies and factories and so forth, that actually peaked as a share of the world's output in 2007. Why? Because if you were a big company, you didn't actually need to own factories all over the world. You could contract with other people who were specialized in this and that. So if your business was marketing a certain type of machine, you didn't need or want to make every single component in that machine. You didn't need to make all of the chemicals that were necessary to produce the parts for that machine. You didn't need to have anything to do with producing the underlying commodities. All of this could be done under contract. And that's why these supply chains were able to grow so long, because you could set up this arrangement where you were going to buy the machine from someone, and that someone would make arrangements with these 6 other companies to supply these key parts, and those 6 other companies in turn would make arrangements with other suppliers to provide components for those parts. Today we've got supply chains in industries like autos and aircraft that are 6, 7, 8, 9 tiers deep, because companies have become very specialized. And the multinational company doesn't need to own much of this stuff, if any of it. Some of our largest quote unquote manufacturers today don't actually own factories themselves. They've contracted everything to other people, and they simply oversee the process.
Fascinating. While all these things were going on, there were two other major undercurrents that were supporting and abating these changes that we were seeing above the ground. And one gigantic change that was going on was the shipping cost. You opened the book with the launch of Emma from Maersk, and how that was supposed to revolutionize the shipping cost and also shipping capabilities. But give us the little bit of overview of how crucial these shipping companies have become in driving the cost of shipping down to almost negligible, and that is one of the main reasons, or one of the reasons, why globalization in manufactured goods happens today.
Yes, of course, back before the container, and we're now going back into the 1960s internationally, it was very common for shipping costs to come to 10% or more of the value of the goods. In some cases, it was up in the 20s. Today, shipping costs are really negligible. You can ship a bottle of wine from Australia to the United States for just a few cents per bottle,
Few
or
cents per bottle.
a few cents per bottle, or a pair of shoes from Indonesia. If you get your running shoes from a factory in Indonesia, that running shoes coming in a cardboard carton, the shipping cost is a dime. I mean, you're not talking about a significant transportation cost for the most part. And so all of a sudden it made sense to send things that were not worth sending. I mean, if you actually had to pay a lot of money to ship goods, then inexpensive goods weren't worth shipping. And as the shipping cost fell, trade grew into all these new products that previously hadn't been traded. What happened with the ship lines is that they discovered that container ships had economies of scale. That is to say, when the ship is larger, it can carry each container at a lower cost. And so over the development of container shipping, ships grew progressively larger. Just to give you a sense of scale, the first modern container ship back in 1956 had 58 containers on it. Today, we're talking about 10 or 12,000 containers on a ship. So there's a quantum difference. But what happened in the early 2000s was that Maersk, then and now the world's biggest ship line, decided to get a jump on its competitors by building a much bigger ship than any that was out there. At the time, the biggest ships out there were carrying about 4,000 or 4,500 truck-sized containers. Maersk built a ship that carried more than 7,500 truck-sized containers, okay, immensely larger than the other ships. And it figured that this would lower its costs, give it a cost advantage over its competitors, and lower the cost of freight to encourage more globalization. What happened with Maersk and with all of the other ship lines that followed it in building giant ships was that they were caught totally off guard by the fact that world trade stopped growing for a while. And then it started growing again, much more slowly than it had before. And so they had these massive ships that they couldn't fill. And of course, the advantages of size were all based on the idea that the vessel would be filled. Running a half-empty container ship around the world was not a recipe for profit. And we saw a lot of ship lines go bust earlier in the past decade.
The second undercurrent in that development was the role of the governments, whether it was China, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, Germany, or Denmark or European Union. There was a significant amount of subsidies and that were given to the shipping companies. And in fact, you have several quotes in the book that I would like to actually point out here, so that could help our listeners get a little bit of better understanding of this thing. Is that some of the shipping companies had become so reliant on these subsidies that it became very detrimental for the entire shipping industry. In fact, one of the executives of the Maersk said that in the end it was not good for anybody in the industry, and these mega ships were good to talk about and discuss that, but in the end they just become very destructive for everybody involved. How entrenched the government role is in making sure that shipping companies keep building bigger and bigger ships and keep having bigger and bigger capacity so that their manufactured goods can reach to the customer?
Well, governments certainly subsidized shipbuilding. This was an important part of the industrial strategies of a number of countries, notably Korea and China. And so it was possible for the ship lines to buy ships much more cheaply than it cost to actually build them. And naturally, that meant that shipping was artificially cheap for the manufacturers and the retailers who wanted to send their goods through these supply chains. There were also other kinds of subsidies that people don't think about so much. For example, European governments, especially Germany, gave huge tax breaks to funds that invested in ships. And so if you had some money to invest, you could simply put it into one of these funds. The funds would invest in a ship, and you would get a personal income tax break every year for investing in this ship.
Like a tax shelter.
It was a tax shelter. And at one point in the early 2000s, about a third of the new container ships coming on the world were owned by Germans, not because they were run by German companies, but because the German government gave this great tax break to German citizens. And again, this artificially depresses the price of ships, brings more ships onto the market than the market really needs, pushes down the cost of freight, and encourages more international trade than would make sense if the people doing the trading actually had to pay the true cost of shipping. So these sorts of subsidies were very significant. We had subsidies for harbors, we had subsidies for dredging and for raising bridges to accommodate these new ships. And these costs generally were not paid by the shippers, they were usually paid by the taxpayers in other ways. So here's a further subsidy. And then, of course, there were a lot of subsidies in various forms going directly to manufacturers. You put your plant here and we'll give you this, we'll give you that, we'll give you the free land, we'll give you this tax break, we'll train your workers for free, we'll do this thing and that thing and the other thing. And so that too encouraged a lot of this movement of manufacturing from one country to another that we've seen in the 21st century.
Here is the quote, as you have in the book: "There is no point in being the largest carrier if we don't translate that into above average margins. In plain English, the mega ships was a disaster for all concerned." And then it says, then that also went for the shipbuilders as well. In many ways, the shipbuilding companies and the ship transportation companies were enjoying these huge benefits for building bigger and bigger ships. But also, you point out a very good point. Now, suddenly, let's say 12,000 or 15,000 containers arrive in a port, but then the port needs more cranes, more storage space, more bigger highways, more trucks, because if you have 15,000 containers come, it will take a few days, or at least sometimes a week or 2 weeks, to just move them off the move them off the wharf.
Yes.
And all that required money.
The ship lines went into these very large ships thinking about themselves. They didn't really think about the transportation system. And so what happened was that these very large ships took a long time to load. Okay, so instead of loading a ship in 1 day, it could now take 2 days. They had very few ports at which they could call, so now a lot of routes got changed and some ports lost service. The ports themselves now were confronted with a very lumpy flow of cargo. Rather than having a smaller ship come every day, now there might be a larger ship come and it would discharge 2,000 or 3,000 containers at once, and then there'd be no ship for the next 3 days. This made it very inefficient to operate the port. It's left the port suddenly submerged under all this incoming and outgoing cargo, followed by several days of quiet when there was no cargo. It took the railroads and the truck lines a long time to get this cargo into and out of the ports on these schedules. And the net result was that shipping services became slower and less reliable. Today, it actually takes a good bit longer to send your freight, say, from Asia to England or to Los Angeles or to New York than it did 20 years ago. And the likelihood that your freight's going to arrive late is much higher now than it was back then. So the freight transport industry has basically regressed in certain ways. It doesn't work as well as it did before, and the companies with these long supply chains aren't being served as well as they were.
Yeah, as we were describing before, in the early or the first stage of globalization, the governments were against expanding the trade. And now, in the third stage or third wave of globalization, the governments are bending backwards to foster as much as possible. But none of these would have happened, as you brought up in the book, without the deregulation of the financial industry and also nations engaging more and more discussions and laying out the rules of engagement through GATT, GATT, and then later on through WTO. Tell us how important those discussions are, even though at times they move slower than the tortoise or what is like watching paint dry on the wall, but they do have some serious consequences.
Sure, the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, as it was called, started after World War II, and the idea was that it would lower trade barriers so trade among countries could increase. Uh, in its early years, the GATT worked pretty well, but then again, it had fairly few members, mostly the United States, Canada, the European countries, a handful of others. Uh, but then over time, the GATT grew, and as it grew, it became harder and harder to have these negotiations because you had more and more countries at the bargaining table. So the GATT went through several rounds of tariff reductions, very significant tariff reductions, up until the 1980s, early 1990s, and then it kind of came to a stop because there was simply no agreement between these many countries with diverse interests. These lower tariffs definitely made a difference. You had many products back in the years after World War II where tariffs were 10 or 15 or 20%. That's a tax put on top. And now, in certainly the wealthier countries, tariffs tend to be quite low on most goods. They're not really a big factor in trade, and many things travel for free. So that's quite an accomplishment. On the other hand, you do have all of these subsidies in international trade, and the GATT's successor, the World Trade Organization, hasn't been able to get rid of them. Again, the World Trade Organization has 161 member countries. You can imagine what it's like when 161 countries sit down and try to negotiate something. It doesn't happen. And so it's been very, very difficult to put trade on a footing where these subsidies aren't a big part of it. And that has really, I think, changed the flow of international trade in a way that perhaps has not gotten the attention that it should.
So, as the telecommunication costs become virtually nothing, and so does the shipping cost virtually become nothing, the governments are bending backwards to promote their version of manufactured goods. Yet, globalization has negative connotation in many countries for various reasons. Some of them are rightly so. There's a one message that you have in the book that is really well done, and that is only very large and very few corporations are able to take advantage of this globalization. Many companies, domestic companies that rely on domestic transportation, they are at a significant disadvantage. And at the same time, the larger corporations have enormous access to the labor markets, uh, the skilled labor forces, and cheaper goods and cheaper transportation costs. That puts the smaller companies at a great disadvantage. Can you tell us how the globalization has really benefited only very few large corporations?
Yes, size has really been helpful in globalization in a couple of ways. One is, as we talked before, freight moves under contract now. It doesn't move at some price that's posted on the wall. If you are a big shipper, you can bargain hard. Okay, you can sit down with the railroad and the ship line and the truck line, and you can get the best price and you can get the best promises about the quality of service, so you know that your goods are going to be delivered on time. If you're a small company, you don't have that advantage. you may have to find somebody to negotiate on your behalf. That's a company called a freight forwarder, for example, and then you have to pay them for doing that, so your costs might be higher. You're not going to get the best deal by yourself. A large company can move production fairly freely around the world. So it can look for whatever is the best location to make this or that, can set up the supply chain in whatever way it thinks is best, and can change that from time to time. A smaller company is not as well positioned to do this. So while many small companies have done fine specializing in one area or another, they're often at the mercy of the much larger companies that control these supply chains. If you're making a component that goes into a particular product that is sold by this particular company, and then the company decides to change its design and get a component from somebody else rather than you, you've got a problem because you may not have as many alternatives. And so I think the balance of power here has very much changed in favor of the larger companies. And that's really a part of globalization. There's no question about that.
There is a sentence that caught my attention in the book. For a successful business that hoped to grow and increase its profit, there was no alternative in globalization. Only a very small percentage of companies were truly global at that time, but still the top 1% of the firms controlled 82% of the U.S. foreign trade in 2007, 15 times the share of 1% firms immediately beneath them.
Yes. These value chains that we've talked about, they're typically organized by the company at the end of the chain. Okay, and it figures out who it wants to buy from. It may figure out whom those suppliers buy from. It may or may not be intimately involved with each link further down the chain. But it really controls this whole thing. That could be a manufacturer. It could also be a retailer, because many of the more sophisticated retailers keep a very close eye on their supply chains. But this is absolutely dominated by very large, very sophisticated companies. And smaller companies end up being a link in this chain somewhere. And they may not have much bargaining power.
As you point out, headquarter economy.
That's correct, yeah. The smaller companies may be very good at what they do, but in most cases, they've got less bargaining power than the guys who are controlling the supply chain.
And another byproduct of the transformation of a supply chain into a value chain is also very difficult to deal with, especially for an economist or a historian or a policymaker. And this becomes a very difficult issue for an average person to even grasp what is going on. As you point out in the book, the spread of value chains meant that the conventional statistics about exports, imports, and trade surpluses and trade deficits revealed very little about how economies were performing, or how about the different companies' economies related to one another, or about workers' living standards and their communities' prosperity.
Yes, this is, I think, very difficult for people to understand. Try to think about where the actual value is in anything you buy. Okay? We traditionally think about the value being added in the manufacturing process. Okay, here's a factory that stamps something, or molds something, or assembles something. And we can identify that as a source of value. But in the modern world, an awful lot of value is added intellectually, if you will. It's added in the form of technology, new products, new ways of thinking about products, new designs, new manufacturing methods. And it's very hard to figure out where that value is being added. People may be familiar with the well-known case of Apple's iPhones, which, as everybody knows, are assembled in China, but most of the value in those iPhones is added in places far away from China. In fact, only a few percentage points of the value is actually in China, and much of it is captured in the United States and in Japan and in Europe by companies that make components or that contribute to the design of components, or in Apple's case, retail the phones. And so when you're thinking about what countries win and lose from international trade, it's really hard to do now. The trade balance really doesn't tell you much about that.
And that has political implications in Europe and in the United States because people think that if you're just engaging with one cheap labor source country, they are the ones who are affecting all the jobs in this country. But that may not be the case, as not only that China is just affecting the manufacturing jobs in Midwest or other parts of the United States. India has also emerged in the next or the fourth wave of globalization, where more and more value creation happens through the internet.
That's right. I think this is one of the changes that is happening now, as I describe in the book, that we're really moving into a phase in which the movement of goods through these value chains is mattering less than the movement of ideas. Okay, we've had trade in goods now. It's still growing, okay, but it's been growing more slowly than the world economy for the past dozen years. The growth is in trade in ideas. And these ideas can take all kinds of forms, from the Japanese TV show that you happened to watch last night, to the design of a new product, to an architectural drawing that a draftsman in India did for an architectural firm in Great Britain. All of this is movement of trade in services. We don't think about that, but that's really where the growth in globalization is now. And this is going to be more and more important. Meanwhile, I think the shipment of goods is going to become less and less important for a couple of reasons. One is, frankly, that most countries, including China, the United States, most of Europe, certainly Japan, Russia, the populations are getting older. Okay, and when you have an older population, consumption of physical goods doesn't grow as much. People who are of a certain age are less likely to buy furniture. They're less likely to buy a lot of clothing. They're much more likely to take themselves out for dinner or go on a trip. Okay, this is how consumption patterns change as people age. And what this means is that manufactured goods become a less important part of the economy in almost every country. At the same time, labor costs aren't mattering as much in manufacturing because of automation. So in a lot of industries, it's possible now to put your factory near where your customers are, rather than have a factory in a place where wages are cheapest. And so I think those kinds of developments are just changing the shape of globalization. Globalization isn't going away. I think that there's been a lot of loose talk about how globalization is over due to COVID-19, and I don't think that's right at all. But I do think that the shape of globalization is changing, and it has much more to do now with trade in ideas than with trade in goods.
What we have seen is, which I think the next wave of globalization that is even more significant, is that we have gone from the goods to the ideas and services. Legal services, accounting services, financial services, engineering services. In fact, at one point you bring it up in the book, is that almost 40% of a product cost is service related, even though it's a manufactured product. So all these things become more and more globalized. It poses some dramatic changes that may be coming down the line in the way we have organized our societies here.
Well, that's right. This is going to affect a different group of workers, obviously, than the manufacturing workers who've been affected by globalization previously. It also affects how we think about who the winners and losers are. Okay, with the globalization of manufacturing, it was relatively easy to say, here was a factory that made this product. This factory closed, and now we import this product from Malaysia or Morocco or wherever it is. And so we identify this group of workers who used to be in that factory, and we send them a little help. They're the losers from trade. But think about how this works in the service economy. Okay, you're working on a software project from a tech center in the United States. A group of US workers works on this project. A group of German workers works on this project. A bunch of people in India work on this project. Maybe they shift the project around the world over the course of a 24-hour day as everybody contributes. Now some of this work is being picked up in Mexico. And then maybe somebody in the United States gets moved to another project, okay? How do we identify that suddenly a certain amount of work moved out of the United States here, that this product is no longer made in this way in the United States? With services, that's not easy. It's not forthright. And so it's very hard to figure out who is being affected by these changing trends in international trade, and perhaps it's going to be a bit more difficult to figure out who we want to assist, particularly if we keep thinking of assistance as something that should go directly to the people who are affected by trade.
The pixelization of our life is just as the globalization in the early part of our century or the previous century had a huge impact for the people involved in manufacturing. The pixelization is going to have a major impact in the service economy. And it's going to be hard to pinpoint who is being badly affected by it, as you pointed out. Fascinating book, very exciting. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.